Hey guys, I'm Cam,
Hey guys, I'm Pat.
and welcome to the Safe Room. Much to my chagrin, Pat here doesn't really play horror games, but we've assembled here in these peak quarantine hours to change that. So each episode here on the Safe Room, we'll be taking a look at a different horror game that Pat has played, hopefully recently, and recounting his experience as well as looking at the genre from his new perspective with a newcomer's lens on a genre that's been around for a long time. So we're very excited to get into it, but before we do that, we want to give you guys a little bit of background about why we're doing this and what Pat's experience is with horror as a medium, both in video games and elsewhere, in films and literature and stuff like that. So, Pat, why are we here?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in horror movies as of genre. Like I tend to watch the movies I watch. I can tend to be more like emotion driven. So
Sure.
horror movies are great because they kind of give that reaction for you. I haven't really experienced much with the video game aspect of it, but I imagine being engrossed in what is basically a horror movie that you're controlling gives you a little bit more means into being there physically, and probably emits even more of an emotional response. I tend to watch the more generic, like The Conjuring and super basic horror
Sure.
movies, but I figured maybe playing some of the games might trigger different responses in my brain, be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think like the immersion aspect of it is something that comes across a lot more. It's like people will go to see horror movies and stuff at like IMAX that have those stupid chairs that vibrate when there's like bass
Yeah.
in the movie because they want like more of an immersive experience, and I think video games are really good at delivering that.
Yeah, it's very easy in a movie theater for there to be a screaming child behind you or at home,
That
sitting
that
on your
happens
phone.
here too.
Yeah, but the screaming child is me while playing the game, so it's
Right.
not really that relevant. But
Sure.
yeah, or you're sitting at home watching a movie on your couch, but then there's life happens. You're on your phone, talking to the person next to you, get up to get drinks and snacks. Like it's playing a video game, and when some of that stuff happens too. But you're controlling the character. The immersion's a lot more.
Yeah, of
As far as
course.
like every other game I've played, it's been a lot more engrossed than just watching a movie. Like I can't watch action movies, but can play
Right.
the Dark Souls of the world. So.
Right, for sure. Yeah, so I think, and hopefully you guys out there watching as well, think it's going to be really interesting to get Pat's perspective on the genre because, at least in my experience, most people that play horror and survival horror and stuff are pretty old to the genre, have been playing it for a while. Like, there's certain games, some of which we'll talk about, one of which we're going to talk about today, that touch a wider audience, but for the most part, it's a really core sort of genre. So we're excited to get into it, and today we could not think of a better place to start off than the enigmatic demo turned contemporary darling in PT, which was released back in August of 2015 as a playable teaser for a now rest in peace canceled Silent Hills project that was being spearheaded by Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro, which we were all very excited about. Which has unfortunately since been canceled, but PT, not only in the content of the game, which in my humble opinion, that's not why we're here, but is one of the greatest contemporary horror games to come out in the last 5 years or so. But it sort of spawned a lot of games to follow suit, stuff like Allison Road, which also unfortunately got canceled. Stuff like Layers of Fear and Visage and Resident Evil 7, especially in beginning hour for Resident Evil 7. All sort of took influences from PT, so it's in the contemporary sense a very influential game on the genre, and so I thought it would be a great place to start Pat off, and also it's obviously a very short experience, so it's easy to digest and easy for us to talk about. So Pat, I don't know how much you had heard just for a peek behind the curtain, the first time we had Pat play this game was a couple of months ago before we started doing this, or had the idea to do this show. But we, did a playthrough last night again to get it fresh in Pat's mind. But Pat, do you remember like what you had heard about the game before you played it?
Yeah. So basically, previous to playing this game, I back when it had come out, I'd heard about the whole the hype around it. Obviously, I didn't hear about it until people started figuring more out about the game, and I kind of knew that it was Silent Hill adjacent right when I heard about it. Probably a couple weeks after people started playing it. But I didn't have a PlayStation, so I had no way to engage. And since then, I didn't end up getting one while it was available, so it kind of just passed me by until you'd mentioned that you'd had access to it, and I'd always been kind of interested in trying it out. So just had you bring it over and let me try it. So
yeah, it's I think it's a really poignant experience, and regardless of how people feel about the genre, I try to like expose a lot of people to it just because I'm personally a big fan. All things considered, part of the reason why we're doing this is because I want to force the things that I love upon Pat. But I think it's a really interesting game, and I'm excited to hear how you feel about it. So obviously the game itself, aside from the part at the end, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, is only like a 30-minute or so experience. What are some of the things that stood out to you?
So the biggest thing I think in this game is the atmosphere. So I played the game again. We said we played this a couple months ago before this whole pandemic had started. But so we were with people. But we played this game in a group setting with like 3 or 4 people in a room together, where someone else hadn't played it either, but I had the controller. And even in that group setting, just the atmosphere that the game portrays is very scary. It's I, at this point, don't really get scared by much movies. Like, it's just, it's interesting to watch, new developers come up with, like, new interesting, directors come up with new interesting movies. But playing the actual game and controlling the character, which you don't really control much of, mostly just walking, is very, very scary. The radio, in particular, just having, like, that constant static or not static, or the kind of different languages just mumbling about was pretty terrifying. It would just turn on and off at random times, and it was pretty spooky. You catch some of the stuff early in the game, just talking about getting shot in the stomach, finding the dad in his car listening to the radio, repeating some numbers. It's just things that movies don't tend to really wrap your head around, like people going insane.
Yeah, it's a video games just due to their nature tend to take just generally, especially in the genre, tend to take a more mature tone than a lot of like popularized horror movies do, just because obviously movies have such a wider audience than video games do, so they can't, like, if you're going to release something in a theater, you can't really like burrow down into that niche if you want more people to see it. But yeah, something that you had said to me, I can't remember if it was while you were playing PT or if it was afterwards, but like the comparison of horror movies to video games, like everyone always shouts at the TV or the screen when you're watching a horror movie that's like, oh no, don't go in there, but it's much harder.
I have to go in there,
right? When you physically have to control and do that.
Yeah, there was a bunch of points in the game where I like would let go of the controller, and just kind of not want to progress, which obviously I'm assuming everybody at this point has played this game, and I'm kind of late to the party, but don't want to do that. It's not it's not the ideal scenario. Don't let go of that controller. So yeah, it was pretty terrifying. Which is like, you want to not progress in the game because you're afraid of what's behind the next door. But not progressing is probably worse than progressing, as far as like a fear standpoint. And then the slamming door of the bathroom, the creak opening, and some of the like they don't really do a lot of like big jump scares, which is like obviously what movies tend to lean towards more, but when they get you, they get you. There's like that bad one, like halfway through, three-quarters of
Right.
the way through the game. You know, the look behind you on the radio like you just hear the radio slightly in the background. You're not really paying much attention to it, and then he just shouts, "Look behind you," and that was a lot. That got me.
The atmosphere I think is so powerful in the game because it does a really good job at driving suspense. Like every time you get jump scared in a game or in a movie or whatever, like each subsequent one after that gets cheapened because you've gotten that adrenaline rush of the thing happening, and so if they just keep repeating that same trope over and over again, it starts to lessen its effect. And I think PT is very good at not doing it so often that when it does, it's very impactful.
Yeah, it was interesting that, especially that part right there, like you think the game's over. Right. Obviously, like it has you wake up back at the place you started. With like very minor things different. Like right. I think I noticed that there was no cockroach crawling in front of me pretty instantly, because someone else in the room that had not played the game as well had said, "Oh well, I think the game's over." I'm like, it's not the same as it was last time. There was very minor differences, and it's kind of interesting, to see that they can do something like that and kind of take play on your fears like that, like. You think it's all over, okay, cool, I'm done, but then they make something just subtle enough that you might not see it, but you probably will catch this as a bit of a difference. Right. I think that's the beauty in the game being so short, too. Like, it's not a game that you can play and then come back to later. Like, you're going to play it in one set.
Yeah, it doesn't overstay its welcome. And, yeah, to reiterate something that you just said, there's a really unique part in that game where... like you think the game ends and it plays the the splash screen at the beginning of the game that shows the developer again before it boots back into the game, and like you said, you realize that you think the game's over, but then you realize that things are different from where you started. I think is a really unique.
Is that where you end up getting the error message screen? Right. Yeah. 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 Crazy. Yeah. That using an error message screen is a feature of the game. Like I thought we broke it.
Right. Yeah, that's a very Kojima sort of thing to do.
Unplugging the controller to fight the boss. Yeah,
right.
For sure.
He's been known to do that in the past for sure. Yeah. Aside from the atmosphere, which obviously is going to be a large portion of talking about this game, but also I assume many of the games to come. There's not a whole lot in PT to talk about as far as gameplay goes, because it's what some people dub, for the most part, a walking simulator where you're just sort of walking through a haunted house. But there is something that is a point of contention for some people, which is worth talking about, which is the puzzle mechanics in PT. Yeah,
a lot of triggers that were weird. I think
excluding the ending of the game. I usually, when I talk about PT, I try to exclude that part of the game because it was meant to be obtuse, but even some of the stuff earlier in the game, I think personally is pretty off the wall.
Yeah. I liked there's one of them, I think really early, like the first time you see the door closed, you walk all the way to the door, then you realize the door is closed, so you turn around to see if you missed something, and then you hear the door open behind you and you go back to it. Like subtleties like that are interesting in that you think that you progress the game the same way. Like you go through the door like several times before anything really happens, and you just keep going through this loop, and you think that nothing's happening until you realize the door is closed. Well, what I have to do, turn around, progress backwards to the door you came into that's also closed, but then when you go to check on it again, it's open again, is pretty interesting.
Right.
And then I think the bathroom scene where you get locked in the bathroom, I had a hard time figuring that one out, but you see the handle jiggle in the mirror, and then it pops open after a few minutes.
Yeah, those two examples are like where the game sort of succeeds and fails at player expectation. Like the first one, like you said, when the door first closes on you, and the player's first incentive is to walk up to the door and see if it's locked, and when you do, that's where you hear the trigger behind you, is I think like really clever, where they tried to anticipate what the player would do. But there are certain times, like in that bathroom scene, where I assume that the developers anticipated how the player would react, and those are where the triggers come from. But they're like pretty unclear if you for some people that play through it.
Yeah, I was definitely in that bathroom for
Right.
a majority of the playthrough, trying to figure out how to get out. Yeah. Something I didn't get on my first playthrough that we took a look at yesterday was the glass crashing portion, where you're walking through and this giant piece of glass falls and smashes on the ground. She is terrifying.
Yeah.
Like looking up at her and seeing her stare down at you just with this crazy grin on her face was like probably, like, even though I wasn't controlling it at this point, probably the scariest part.
Yeah, I think that one's really good, and it's unfortunate that a lot of people miss it because just thinking back to your own reaction when you played it the first time is you walk down the hallway and then it's I think it's like a window pane or something falls from the balcony above, and it makes a very loud crash, obviously, because it's breaking glass, and you like jumped and said, "Holy shit, what is that?" But like nobody.
My first instinct was to stop. Yeah,
right. Nobody suspects to like
look
up where it came from, which is I think one of the cooler parts of the game, but a lot of people do miss it.
I think that there's some merit to that, though. Like having something that you don't see the first time like makes the second playthrough a little more interesting.
Sure. I
mean, I guess they weren't really looking for that to be
subsequent
what this was,
yeah.
But I don't think they were thinking this game was going to be a hit. I think it was, obviously it was supposed to be a teaser. But yeah, I think that it makes the subsequent playthroughs a little more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Other than that, I think the game does suffer a little bit from, Pat, when he played it, had me there who had played it several times to sort of lead him in the right direction when things were a bit obtuse. And I do think that PT unfortunately suffers from some puzzles not being exactly as straightforward as you would think. Like the one that comes to mind that Pat had some trouble with, which he can allude more to. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was the hello puzzle where there's two lines of text on two different walls in the house.
Yeah, I had no idea that interacting with... It took me like several minutes to figure out that interacting with that wall, obviously place the letters on the other one. Like you can remove the letters by staring at them. Right. That one and the picture puzzle, very similarly. Most of them were, if you looked around, you could find them. But the pause menu puzzle piece was not something I think that having you not in the room, I think I would have never finished that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, some of them are very obtuse, and I think, obviously, the goal of the game, at least that we've heard from Hideo Kojima, the director of the game, is that he had hoped that it would take the internet a couple weeks to solve the game, to get to the reward at the end, which is, the teaser for Silent Hills, but it ended up taking the internet a little under 3 days, but...
That's a long time for the internet.
Yeah,
That's a long
for sure.
time for the internet.
For, however many thousands of people played the game. But yeah, that means that a lot of the puzzles are pretty obtuse. And, obviously, I'm not trying to make excuses for the game, but, it is a side effect of why it was created.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think that's most of the triggers, if I'm not forgetting any.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of it until you get to the end of the game, which is not so much part of the game. There's a series of very complicated triggers that don't really make a whole lot of sense that you have to do in order to get the teaser at the end.
That seems intentional in him wanting to make it difficult. I think it's better that they're all kind of mashed in at the end of the game, so you can get the fun, interesting experience, and then the clock changes, and the game is no longer the same. I think that's interesting that this is where the game now becomes how long does it take the internet to figure this out? Because everything else before that was pretty achievable if you just played through, but having it all be mashed at the end lets you, lets someone enjoy the game for what it is, and then just be done with it there.
Yeah, that is totally true. Like most of the fun, like cool, I figured it out puzzles are all before that ending sequence, where the rest of it is just sort of bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we covered most of it. Do you have any final thoughts about the game?
No, it makes me excited to play more. I mean, I know there's not a million games like it. It's kind of unique in that aspect, where it is a walking sim that feels very, very scary. I know you mentioned a couple other ones in the beginning, so we'll have to try some of those out. But
right,
yeah,
yeah. So I think the game that we're going to move on to next is going to be Resident Evil 7, which is another contemporary title, one that came out a few years ago. That I think is a good way to ease Pat into the genre by taking looks at things that are a little bit more modern before we go deep diving into older games. Not going to name any names, but I think that pretty much puts a bow on Kojima's maybe finest work to date that we may or may not ever see anything more from. But yeah, that's our show for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this little pilot episode that we're doing here in quarantine. We're hoping that future episodes will be filmed locally, so that we don't have to worry about this Discord webcam nonsense.
Yeah, it's not ideal.
Yeah, but we do what we can. But thank you guys for watching. If you have any suggestions for the show, be sure to let us know. Any games that you want Pat to play that you think would be particularly impactful, let us know those as well. Pat, do you have any words for the illustrious internet people?
Yeah, no, I appreciate spending the time to let me talk about games that I'm bad at. Taking I guess a trip down memory lane for most people and playing some of probably their favorite games. I know they're your favorite games, but
right.
Hopefully I don't say anything too offensive in these videos.
Well, that's what it's about, right? Like, we want the new perspective. I don't want to, I want to try my best to not put any words into your mouth and just sort of just let you, talk about the game how you see fit.
This podcast will probably last until you make me play Dino Crisis, and then we will never talk again.
That's going to be a tough one.
Probably what's going to happen.
Yeah. So we'll see when we get there. Maybe by that time there'll be a remake coming out. But, one can
dream.
hope.
You can dream.
But from us here in the safe room, this has been our pilot, and we'll see you in the next one.
Bye.